Yo. Hey everyone, happy weekend. Today I want to talk about something pretty important to me, something that I studied a lot in philosophy in college. We're going to talk about Reiki and when the God slot is empty. So, what do I mean by that? Well, man arranges his world by logic. And logic is deduction, critical thinking, reasoning, and thought. And we use these thought processes to come to the truth, to process reality and arrive at the objective. The objective being what is true regardless of who is looking at it, with subjective being the way we see the world, right? So man's God resides at the top of this reasoning system. Yahweh sits upon his throne in heaven in judgment of the heavenly host and mankind below him. Karma, which comes to us from the East. Karma is essentially a consciousless system. It does not have a mind of its own, so to speak, but it is a system which judges us by our behavior, and through the judgment of this system, impartial rather than personal like a god, our fates are decided. So in religion, we could be thrown into an unfavorable afterlife for not reaching the acceptance of the one who is judging us, like a god. And in karma, we can be reincarnated as a cockroach, which is also a pretty unfavorable afterlife, if similarly we don't rise to the occasion of doing the behaviors we need to do in order to not be judged harshly by these heavenly systems. Similarly, although some would argue me, I would say that the scientific approach also has a problem with this because the scientific approach ends in nihilism. Nihilism being the ability or the process philosophy of using critical reasoning in order to break down all things, including religion, into the truth. Now, some would say that nihilism means breaking everything down into meaninglessness, and that nihilism is a philosophy of meaninglessness, but it's not. It's a belief that one should use man's logic and reasoning in order to whittle down what is presented into the truth, to whittle away the falsehoods into what is objectively so. The nature, however, of the scientific method is constant criticism and judgment, because we can run 1,000 experiments to see if something is true, take out 999 of them as false, and yes, we will have a theory out of all of the hypotheses that we can follow. But any good scientist will tell you that a theory is not supposed to turn into a new religion. A theory is supposed to be able to be disproved with enough experimentation and data if the consequent data shows that the original conclusion is false. And so, though many scientists and many atheists and many nihilists say and indeed believe that their God slot is empty, in truth, regardless of whether it's empty of an actual deity, in the same way that sort of karma is amongst Hindus, similarly, it is the God slot position is still filled with judgment as being the ultimate manifestation of mind, the objective judge. And though in religion it is often assumed that our God is the objective judge, in science we say the scientific method will lead us to the objective truth, even though we can never actually get there, because at any time any finding can be revised with new evidence. So if the God slot in the mind in all of these cases is filled by something, how then am I saying that it is empty? Well, I'll tell you, it's because of lack. So judgment comes from lack. The God slot is, as it resides today in the mind of man, is judgment. objective or otherwise. And that judgment comes from the lacking of something. Even in something like criminal law, if someone has been hurt, their well-being, hurt by a criminal act, their well-being has been taken from them, and judgment is required in order to determine what punishment is necessary for the person who was injured to receive just reimbursement, right? The idea of lack is the absolute foundation for how man sees the world right now. Lack of resources, lack of land, lack of space for an expanding population, lack of time, lack of love, lack of energy. And we have to accept, as I see it at least, that regardless of what you want to say about what resides in the God slot of man's mind, that slot is responsible for our morality. And if the ultimate form of man's mind, if the ultimate concept, and the only concept that's up there as the ultimate, is judgment, and that judgment comes from lack, because indeed we have to judge carefully so that I can get enough, so that my family can get enough, so that my nation can get enough. The mind is oriented in lack, and that gives rise to the ultimate slot of the mind, which is the quote-unquote objective judge. And that's either filled by a religious figure or it's filled by one's knowledge as one believes they are approaching truth. So what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that if your morality is based on lack and the objective judgment needed in order to survive that lack, then that can lead to harsh judgment or corrupt judgment because of the other, of other people, of the stranger. Because if our minds are oriented in lack, and if the only way to deal with that lack is to be the judge, or at least be a servant of the judge, or be an adherent or a scholar of the judge and the proper way to judge things, then that means we are justified in doing and taking things from others in order to serve our lack. And that means all sorts of ways that we can inflict violence and pain and suffering on other people, because it's justified, because we have judged that our lack, just like anyone would take their own lack, is paramount, and so too is the judge, however we want to see it. And this leads to the beliefs of God hates my enemies just like I do, or the more secular version, which is it is logical to think that my enemies should suffer, or it is logical to think, given my own reasoning, which of course comes from the highest place in my mind, it is logical to think I'm always right. So that paints the picture of how even in the believing and even in the righteous, the God slot can remain empty, is because it is essentially the engine of the judgment that it remains paramount in the mind of man is fueled by man's lack. And in my mind, that immediately speaks to the faultiness of the resident of the God slot. In science, it's a lot easier to get around this, because they can say, well, eventually we'll figure out the truth, and eventually we'll figure out resources, and eventually we'll figure out infinite energy, and then we can solve it then. But the idea that these deities set up a system that it's so easy to fail in, morally speaking, and that this all-powerful beings, omniscient beings, need us to return, or else they'll be very angry and cross with us and put us in a bad afterlife, that leads the God slot of our mind, the top of the hierarchy in our minds, in a very shaky slot, because it doesn't make a lot of sense that God can be all-powerful if we keep slipping through the cracks somehow. So what do we do now that we see that this spot is essentially empty and that we have essentially become indoctrinated by lack? I mean, lack is a real thing. Some people are lacking money for rent. Some people are lacking resources for healthcare. I mean, there are some people who can't even eat in the world. So how can we fill this God slot with something that can endure even under these circumstances? And that is where I beat the drum of what I am trying to get across in this channel, and a lot of people, I think, are opening up to, and that's the energy, this spirit, this, prana, as they say in Hindu, this consciousness, and not the personal consciousness that scientists say only exists in your brain. I'm talking about like the Jungian Gaian collective unconscious, this consciousness that resides behind the scenes of even matter itself, that quantum physicists are slowly, well, not slowly, they've been at it since the 90s, but eventually coming around to explaining scientifically. This energy is empowering to us. And when we are filled with this energy, we strip from ourselves lack, and we find things to focus on that are bounteous, even if it's just small things like waking up in the morning or seeing a friend who you haven't seen in a while. The boundless bounty, for lack of a better term, that well-being can bring is scientifically documented. When we are taking care of our bodies, when we are allowing angry thoughts and worried thoughts to slip from our mind and return to gratitude, even if it's just for being breathing, that can bring a sense of well-being. And I know there's suffering out in the world, and I know that a lot of people don't feel well-being with a lot of their time, but I think that it is the source of much of our misery to act when we are not in well-being. And that's why I think understanding the energy, getting in tune with it, doing whatever you can to be in resonance with your energy, your, higher self, soul, whatever you want to call it, and making sure that the thing you are in touch with when you are resonating with your highest self is something of well-being. It is not a part of you that is sitting in judgment saying we don't have enough, because the source within you, the energy, etheric being within you, has enough infinite energy because it is made of ki. It is made of the energy that permeates the entire universe. And when we, I'm running out of battery. When we access that and we accentuate that, we bring ourselves to a place of well-being. And in that place of well-being, where we are without lack and we are without judgment, from there we can find our morality, because that's the best place to start. Not from judgment and not from missing out or feeling like someone else is responsible for why we feel bad. It's finding our own inner source of feeling good and deciding to make decisions from there. That's how we move forward, even though our God slot may be empty. We fill it with well-being, and with that well-being, we decide. Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.